Hey everyone, KYT here. It's been a while. New glasses, I'm really happy about that. Bad news is I'm still feeling quite sick with my kid recovering from pneumonia as well. Still recovering this week. It's been rough. It's been a rough patch, which is why there hasn't been a video in a while. But I'm here to talk about withholding tax, something that's brought up a lot in a lot of beginner forums and on the Blossom app, and here to give my take on why I don't really care about it. And for those of you who haven't even started yet, just so you know, you can sign up using some of the links below on Wealthsimple or Questrade and get free money for signing up and starting an account and start on your investing journey. So let's talk about the basics of why withholding tax might be relevant to an investor. Many countries, including Canada, have tax treaties with the US to ensure a reduced rate of withholding tax. For qualifying Canadian residents, the tax can be reduced to 15%. In a registered retirement savings plan, RRSP, the tax may be reduced to 0%. So dividends paid out with a US listed ETF will not be subject to withholding tax. It will go down to 0%. This is an agreement between Canada and the US because it encourages Canadians to invest in US companies. Likewise, I think the US also has the same thing for their IRAs and their 401ks. They have some rules that reduces your tax when they're invested in Canadian stocks as well, from what I've researched. So if we jump into my account, we would need to be in my retirement account, the RRSP, and invest in something like VOO, which is USD, US listed. And this is a very popular ETF. The Canadian version would be VFV in CAD. So if you put this in the RRSP and it pays out dividends, the 15% withholding tax would be automatically deducted by the ETF, and you wouldn't get that back. Versus VOO, that 15% is not deducted. And so a lot of people will say, well, obviously VOO, if you save 15%, that sounds like a lot tax, right? But when you think about how it's only on the dividends, then it's not as big of a difference as you think. It's not going to have that huge of an impact. So if we look at VOO, for example, the yield is 1.47%. Essentially, if you had $1,000 in VOO, in the first year, you'd be saving $2.20. And that's why it's not as big of a deal as some might think it is, right? You have to zoom out and look at the big picture as well, because there are other costs to consider. There's currency conversion costs. If you're converting from Canadian to USD, depending on how you do it, it might as well cost you more than the $2.20 that you're saving. So that's something to think about. Now, sometimes I'll see comments that really make withholding tax seem like a huge deal. Like this one, if you're 60 years old and are reliant on passive income for a paycheck and getting $100,000 per year in dividend payments, then paying $15,000 per year in withholding tax is a pretty big deal, especially when it's 100% avoidable. So this does sound like a lot, $15,000 per year. But when I think about how realistic the scenario is, it might not be realistic for most of us to be paid $100,000 in dividend payments unless we have some sort of like extremely high dividend yield sort of portfolio, which of course on this channel we don't recommend. But let's say we had VOO in our example, right? To be paid that much in dividend payments at the VOO type of yield would require something over like $6 to $7 million in your RRSP specifically. So that's a scenario that, again, I'm not seeing myself ever having to pay $15,000 a year. Now, with that said, I do think there are benefits, and I want to highlight the fact that the benefit is cumulative. So every year you're taking advantage of that 15% savings. So back to our $1,000 example, even though you're saving $2.20 the first year, if it grows, if your investment grows, every year you're saving on that 15%. So that adds up. So you only have to do currency conversion once, and then you save it a lot of money the longer you hold it. So you will break even eventually and surpass that. You'll be in the profit for making that move. So Momentum Finance did that move, where here he talked about 3 months ago, he sold 500 shares of XEQT into VT and VTI in his RRSP. It was a painful $148 in USD, but he doesn't plan to touch it for at least 10 years. And talking to him, there are a lot of considerations because XEQT, when you think about it, the entire dividend is not entirely US, right? Most of it because Canadian companies, most of Canada is like dividend payers. So a lot of that dividend is from Canada. And so you're just saving on the portion of the dividend that is US. And talking to him about it, we thought it would take at least 10 years to break even, but then he would surpass, that this move will surpass if he just left it alone. But we also talked about like the consideration that when you retire, you might want to convert it back to Canadian. So that's another currency cost down the line when you have a bigger amount to consider as well. So it's going to require a long holding for you to want to make this move. I was able to find a similar example on the Globe and Mail. Here I have $30,000 that I want to invest in an S&P 500 index fund for my RSP. Would you recommend VFV or VOO? And similar conclusion here, and I'll offer the link in the description. But the highlight here is, given their MER differences, the fact that you have to convert currency, they had reasonable assumptions. And given these assumptions, the analysis indicated that the Canadian listed VFV would produce a higher return for a holding period of up to about 11 years, after which the US listed VOO would come out ahead. This is because although VOO gets dinged by the initial currency conversion, it compounds on a faster rate because no withholding tax applies and the MER is lower and eventually overtakes VFV. The difference in returns, even over long periods, would still be relatively small. However, on a $30,000 initial investment, after 20 years, VOO's advantage over VFV would be less than $4,000. Given the many variables at play here, real-world returns could be very different, of course. And that's if, again, if you're like Mo, who has like a significant significant portion to convert. And, well, he also does have an advantage. I love you, Mo. And here we have $30,000 initial investment. Most of us are just starting out investing, like trying to invest $100 a month, $200 a month. You're trying to get there slowly. And I just don't see the benefit of doing that if you're converting to US dollars with such small amounts. Here, you're getting the max benefit because you have this $30,000. And even then, it takes quite a while for you to reap the rewards versus, again, that's why I don't see the benefit when you have a small amount to start with. It's going to take even forever, maybe even past the time horizon that you want to invest in with that money. So it might not be worth the complication of having US listed stuff. And of course, I gotta mention some all-in-one specifics. I was able to talk to Ben and even watch an old Ben video where he talked about, he estimated the extra cost of having something like VGRO and XGRO in your RSP to be about 20 basis points, which he considers extremely reasonable for the simplicity of just holding something like that in your RSP and just paying it in Canadian, without having to do any currency conversion. So do I see myself changing my portfolio at some point to take advantage of this? Possibly. Once it gets to a certain amount, I will reevaluate things. Certainly, I might not hold XGRO and everything forever, even though it's currently the simplest solution and one of the best. But that's something I will consider depending on the amounts. But for most beginners starting, they already worry too much about withholding tax, especially with their starting amounts, and they usually bend their portfolio a little too much. For example, I see a lot of people post that this is how they want to split their portfolios: Canadian stocks, US growth stocks that don't pay a dividend in their TFSA, and then their RSP is filled with US dividend stocks or ETFs. And that might not be, like when you look at the portfolio as a whole and you split it in different percentages, that might not be the allocation that is good for you. As a lot of, even Ben Felix preaches, he preaches asset allocation more than asset location, which is how you strategically place different assets, is less important than how each of them is allocated geographically, and to make sure that you're properly diversified instead of bending your entire strategy on one metric, which is withholding tax. Because not everything you do is, no, it's good to not pay MERs that are way too expensive, of course, but you don't avoid costs everywhere. So an example would be how in XGRO and VEQT, how in its components outside of Canada and US, we're paying extra MER to have exposure to international and emerging markets because we think it's a better diversification. Likewise, It's important to, I think, not necessarily build your portfolio to just minimize or to benefit from withholding tax, when a more diversified strategy at the cost of withholding tax is better for you overall. Like your total return is better. So it's not about cutting costs at every specific corner. It's be able to zoom out and view everything as a whole. And maybe it does make sense to you. Like if I have a really giant portfolio, maybe that withholding tax would hurt me so badly that I really have to change it to a US listed ETF, especially if I plan to hold that for a long time. So, you know, everything to consider, but at the end of the day, probably over-exaggerated by most investors, especially those starting out. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.